Today we're going to be looking at another one of Alternate History Hub's videos, specifically the Fallout Wars and alternate Soviet collapse. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Tyler Folse. I'm a nuclear engineer with a little over 10 years of experience in the commercial nuclear power industry, from engineering to operations to emergency response. I don't claim to know everything there is nuclear, but I can certainly share some knowledge. Let's check this out.
Insecurity, secrecy, corruption, lies. Decades of decadent decision-making erupted in 1986 after a failed security test blew the nuclear reactor of Chernobyl wide open. In this particularly unlucky timeline, over half of the nuclear material was blown open.
So this is his follow-up video to a previous video that I also made a reaction to, where he asked what if Chernobyl was far worse. If you haven't seen that already, I'll pin that in a comment down below. Please check it out. But the short version of that, he said over 50% of material was released would create this near apocalyptic scenario and train of events that would somehow cause the entire site to melt down. Even if that was true, it wouldn't cause the events that would create a Fallout franchise type scenario to develop in Ukraine and much of the Soviet Union like he described. Again, details are in that video, but it would take millions of times more radioactive material just to get that far. Simply doubling or less than doubling of the amount of material released isn't going to get you there. If anything, it might actually make some aspects of the cleanup a little bit easier, and that a lot of the material isn't concentrated in one spot right after during the accident. Because remember, during the accident, the roof was blown off and everything was exposed. So the remaining 70%, going by that logic, was sitting there on fire at the core, giving first responders extremely high dose rates. So in a case where more than 50% of material is released, the first responders that are right by the core might actually get less dose rate, but the dose rate everywhere else is going to go up. So no, we're not talking a scenario where it's going to affect the other reactors at the Chernobyl site. But for the purpose of this video, let's just continue on and say it did and look at further implications for that, just for fun.
Banning the emergency response in the middle of the night.
I do love the little characters he makes, though. That's pretty funny.
The fire reached the diesel generators, and the entire facility was engulfed in this radioactive inferno. The poison...
Fire reaching the diesels? I mean, yeah, diesel fuel is flammable. That's going to cause more cascading explosions and further damage to the site. There are, within the US anyway, I can't really speak for Chernobyl, emergency procedures that involve those kinds of scenarios where just the facility gets damaged. So like a fire in the diesel building, there are fire pre-plans with the on-site fire brigade ready to respond. And fire in the diesel building would be pretty bad in that you're losing a backup power supply to your safety systems. Now, that's not saying you're losing your safety systems, because each diesel generator is not in the same room. It's in the same building, but there's heavily reinforced concrete in between one and the other, at least at the plant that I worked at. Now, Chernobyl didn't have that same level of robustness, but they didn't have all the diesels right on top of each other either. So, and the main risk and how you'd respond to that is just to contain it. And the buildings are designed that way, and really just to keep the fire from spreading to, say, one diesel to the other, or a fire spreading to other parts of the facility. Note that the diesel generators are not in the reactor building. They're not even adjacent to the reactor building. There's quite a bit of concrete between where the diesels would be and where the reactor is, and quite a bit of space for that matter. So while diesels catching fire is bad, you don't want to lose your backup power supply. That's never a good thing, especially since their diesels are a backup source for your safety systems. But that by itself is certainly not the end of the world. I mean, it's nowhere near as severe as the actual Chernobyl event that happened.
Into the groundwater and was carried in every direction by the winds, kindling the nationalistic spirits which were already on the edge.
Carried in every direction by the winds. This is an interesting scenario. So the wind is there a tornado? The wind's blowing everywhere too. I mean, he's creating the worst case scenario, so let's go ahead and throw a tornado. A radioactive tornado, an atomic twister, if you will. By the way, if you haven't seen my reaction to the Z movie Atomic Twister, I encourage you to check it out. It's pretty bad. And that reactor design is even worse than Chernobyl, if you can believe that.
But despite the name, the Fallout Wars which reshaped humanity were not started because of radiation, but fear. Sheer hysteria, which spread faster and further than the nuclear clouds.
Probably the one thing he got right. Now this thing he would probably be right about in terms of fear spreading worse than the actual nuclear disaster. I mean, there were all these conspiracy theories out there about 3 Mile Island during the 3 Mile Island event, which wasn't much of a radiological release, and actual studies done after 3 Mile Island, post-accident studies, it was contained. There was no increased risk, no increased cancer risks to the public after the 3 Mile Island event. That's an example of more of a public relations failure than anything else as far as the effects on the public. Yes, the 3 Mile Island accident was bad in that the operations and emergency response was bad, but radioactive material never left the reactor building. And the biggest real hazard associated with that was all the increased stress and increased fear, the evacuations. That caused more damage than the actual 3 Mile Island accident. So, especially since people are afraid of radiation, they don't understand things because they don't understand it, then even in a worse super Chernobyl, yeah, I think he's spot on in that the fear is going to be worse than the actual accident.
For this reaction, the same one as in 1914, a political assassination. While visiting his family, Mikhail Gorbachev.
Okay, what's up with Gorbachev? Why does his birthmark look like Mexico? Is he just being silly? Or maybe it's from the radiation. The radiation turned his birthmark into Mexico. There you go.
Was gently poked by the umbrella of an unknown KGB agent. The tip contained ricin.
That guy looked all too happy to see him. Okay, we're getting with ricin. So, Breaking Bad style poisoning, okay.
Before long, the Soviet Union went from being in a crisis to going into free fall. The perestroika was the most radical series of reforms since the death of Stalin, and since it had only been a year after their introduction, their only outcome
and now he has backwards Mexico. Okay.
Splitting the Soviet Union into a conservative and progressive camp. But now Chernobyl was here to turn that split into an all-out fracture. Any general with an army in his pocket became a warlord, reigning over a swath of land in the middle of a geopolitical calamity.
I mean, if this accident was worse enough that it somehow created physical barriers, ideological barriers, and let's face it, the Soviet Union probably wasn't the shining example of national unity back in 1986 to begin with. I'm beginning to think this Chernobyl, this magical super Chernobyl he's making this worse just because in the event of creating some sort of crisis. Maybe if every Soviet nuclear reactor suffered a super Chernobyl all at once, that could throw a little bit more onto this fire. By the way, this map just shows especially the ones that were Soviet designed but not built within the Soviet bloc, just to add that little more zest to this crazy Soviet nuclear scenario.
To its collapse, the semblance of a centralized Soviet Union had sent a large army to deal with the rebellions in Ukraine and Belarus, as those territories were integral to its existence.
These hats are just silly. These characters.
The head of the reigning party was chopped off, dozens of factions attempted to seize power. Despite this being a sequel, chosen by the audience in the previous poll, there are too many factions to cover in a single video, so let's stick with the most prevalent ones.
Sure. Archangels.
Picture this. If the US...
I like the Geiger counter sound effect. And yeah, Geiger counters would probably be the most cost-effective. That was maybe one of the things that the HBO Chernobyl series got right, where you just set they're cheap, can be manufactured quickly, they're not exactly difficult to operate, and really their role is just to see where the radiation is just to tell you, hey, there's radiation here. Probably not where it should be. So they were very heavily used during the real Chernobyl cleanup and response. Because again, the roof got blown off the reactor and debris everywhere the wind blew.
And the Soviets ever duked it out. Germany was the heavyweight ring where the gloves would come off first. That's why the Warsaw Pact had their biggest stash of weapons.
Is this going to lead to World War III? Let's see.
In '86, the Soviet Union was flexing with the world's largest army, boasting 3.8 million troops, more than Uncle Sam, France, Italy, and the UK put together. Of its 40,000 modern tanks, over 7,000 of them, most of which were T-64s, were stationed in East Germany. Alongside them, you got 340,000 Soviet soldiers and their extended families, and Lushchev was their direct military leader. Within a year, all of them would receive the news that a nuclear reactor was spilling poison headed their way. Ukraine and Belarus were in an open rebellion, and now their supreme leader was dead.
Okay, so in this scenario, for high radiation to make it as far as Germany, and they also said earlier this was flown in every direction. Yeah, so I would not be exaggerating when I would say millions of times more than the actual accident in terms of just radioactive material. Now, on the other hand, they could just be told this, because technically radiation does get diffused and will eventually spread everywhere, but it'll be in such a low concentration that it would be irrelevant. But due to the fear of radiation, it might not actually take that much just to inspire more fear in a group of people. It would just take that much in order to cause any actual effect. So, can certainly play this game and use it to rally people, to ignite the flames of revolution. I mean, people have done it over a lot less in real life, so plausible for an alternate history scenario. Makes me wonder if he's going to make a Hearts of Iron 4 mod for this.
From the motherland, they would cling on Peter Lushchev and follow his every command. Lushchev wasn't just any military man. He was a hardliner. Gorbachev's reforms? Nope. Chernobyl debacle?
Sure.
Hated it. When the Soviet government went off the rails, he decided to take charge. Ring any bells? It should. Lushchev's tactics mirrored those of Kolchak, complete with cozying up to the West. While Reagan celebrated the Soviet meltdown, he also knew that a country with the world's largest nuclear...
Celebrated the Soviet meltdown. Well said, well said.
...going rogue was a nightmare scenario. So he made a deal with Lushchev, legitimize him as the Soviet leader, and provide a safe passage through the Baltic Sea, backed by naval support from the US and UK.
So he's evacuating all of his troops and maybe not the tanks. I'm just picturing a bunch of tanks, somehow getting onto an aircraft carrier. Again, this sounds like a Hearts of Iron 4 mod because we're talking about tanks and all of that.
In return, a unified Germany. The Archangels had a powerful base with a unique cultural identity from the north, but more importantly, possessed the largest and most organized military force out of any other faction. The Berlin Wall was torn down, and Germans cheered on as their occupiers were now laying siege to Leningrad, with aid from the West.
So the Berlin Wall comes down earlier in this timeline, but now it's just straight up free-for-all over the radioactive carcass of the Soviet Union.
Who exactly were they fighting against? In our timeline, the 1991 coup was a bloodless flop, but in this 1987, things took a darker turn, even though it had support from similar factions within the Soviet government. This committee, following the murking of Gorbachev, declared martial law and seized power. They paraded themselves as a provisional government, promising to tidy up Chernobyl and ensure a smooth transition to new leadership.
What's interesting is in this scenario, I can see like just groups of people that want to seize power, this mainly being an opportunity for that. Now, as far as like the psychological aspect, so let's say it was the realistic 50% release where Chernobyl was just slightly worse. I say slightly, it's slightly worse for the world's worst nuclear accident. It's still pretty bad. It's not as bad as this scenario makes it out to be, but it would still be far worse for the nuclear industry, for the people involved, people in the surrounding area, because it would affect more than just the first responders in this case. But I don't know enough about Soviet politics or the psychology behind it to see if that would be enough. That is the realistic worst scenario to cause an earlier collapse of the Soviet Union. It probably wouldn't have to be millions of times worse for that, in terms of radiation release anyway.
Behind the facade lay the conservative elite, exploiting the chaos to shore up their grip on power. While the outlying regions had already peeled away, Moscow and other key centers still clung to the hope of restoring order by any means necessary. Losing Belarus and Ukraine to rebels would be a catastrophe, and the initial knee-jerk reactions had left swaths of soldiers and equipment stranded deep within irradiated zones.
That's the one thing where it would deviate, is if everyone just drops their equipment and runs. But if you're in a tank would actually provide a decent amount of shielding because it's armor. I mean, thick materials such as lead and concrete are great at protecting you from gamma radiation and easily beta radiation. And those are the main emitters from the fission products that are going to be hazardous at this point. A tank might not do, depending on the thickness of armor, if you put, say, a nuclear reactor, an operating nuclear reactor right next to a tank, somehow, the neutron radiation is still going to kill you, because neutron radiation has much deeper penetrative power compared to gammas and betas. But neutron radiation isn't a hazard after the accident at this point. The neutron radiation went away after the real accident. When the reactor tore itself apart, that shut down the reaction as far as it emitting neutrons. Now, there's still heat and there's still radiation, but that's from the fission products, which is primarily beta and gamma sources. Not nearly as deadly as the neutrons, but still, those are the nastiest aspects associated with nuclear power. And those are the main things that nuclear power plants today are designed to protect the public from, are the fission products. Less so the uranium or the plutonium for that matter, because plutonium does get made over the course of core life just by neutron absorption. But those aren't the main hazards. So the point is, if you're in a tank and a nuclear accident just happened, stay in the tank and drive the tank to safety.
Wind pattern and geography, the routes from Minsk and Kiev to Moscow were laced with radiation. It would take so much more radiation, but again, all right. So we're back to the super hyper exaggerated Chernobyl. Even though in this case we talked about radiation going to Germany, and now we're talking about it going to Kiev. So this omnidirectional nuclear maelstrom scenario. Tasked with suppressing the rebels morphed into anarchic fallout survivors, scavenging whatever they could find. To gain legitimacy and placate the general public,
this just sounds like the idea for a video game more than anything else. I'm sure it'd sell well.
The SOEC shut down all operational nuclear reactors and armed 24 battalions with one clear goal.
So shutting down all operational nuclear power plants. So, not an expert on the Soviet grid infrastructure, but they need to do that kind of controlled rather than a knee-jerk, go ahead and press the AZ5 button, the reactor scram, the emergency shutdown for all of them all at once. That could cause a good bit of chaos. Though one interesting thing to note is, despite portrayal in the media as nuclear power as some Soviet or Russian thing, primarily due to Chernobyl, but it only accounted for 6.5% of electricity demand. So provided the grid operators don't do anything rash, there is a way to do that without causing widespread power outages. But if you do a knee-jerk reaction, even 6.5%, depending on demand, grid capacity, that sort of thing, you could cause mass blackouts that could end up killing more people than the actual Chernobyl accident. Note that that would happen if you suddenly shut down any type of nuclear power plant, or any type of power plant, not necessarily just the nuclear ones. So, but I can see this a knee-jerk reaction. Oh, one nuclear power plant did a scary nuclear thing. Let's turn off all the other nuclear thingies to make sure they don't do that. Seems legit.
Down every raider they could find to be displayed on the Red Square. These groups came to be known as the Liquidators, and also had a covert secondary task.
Different type of Liquidators from the cleanup crew after the real Chernobyl. Okay.
Coordinated by the KGB. Wipe out any vocal opposition to the provisional government. This gave the committee the stability necessary to tackle larger problems. And early in 1988, they mobilized the vast military from all the bases around Moscow. Within months, a blitz attack engaged against the numerous republics to the east and south. The Don Republic had its capital of Rostov leveled to the ground, just to set an example. After that, the Chuvash and Mariel republics quickly surrendered and defected to the committee. Then, nearly 2 years after Chernobyl, the Battle of Saransk dealt a blow to the dreams of a revitalized Soviet Union. By Sergei.
What was that picture? So 2 years passed, so he didn't mention any use of nuclear weapons. I mean, the effects of Chernobyl, the accident, were quite different than the effects of weapons, but I'm surprised he's not using the similar logic, and that's like, that some people wouldn't think, well, the area's already nuked, you might as well nuke it again just to make sure no one takes it or something. It'd make about as much sense as anything else. By the way, even if you hit the Chernobyl site with a nuclear weapon, it wouldn't cause widespread radiation between Kiev and Germany on the levels that they're saying it is.
Romaev, a retired marshal and head of the Republic of Mordovia, the defenders repelled the enemy with cunning tactics, inflicting heavy losses. This became a rallying cry, and led to the formation of the United Republics of Russia.
Oh, green one. Okay.
The combined strength of the 9 republics made them into the third formidable faction in the Fallout Wars. Together they ruled over a large population, with vast amounts of resources. Around this juncture, the protracted negotiations between the Archangels in the west reached a climax, just as Peter's formidable 300,000-strong army executed a pincer movement on Leningrad. Forces descended upon the junta government from Archangelisk itself, as well as Finland and the Baltic Sea. It was very reminiscent of World War II, the city defiantly holding its ground for a grueling 4 months. But with determination, and bolstered by Western supplies, it emerged victorious. The Archangels celebrated the liberation of Russia's second largest city, while the URR made strides by conquering Yaroslavl.
I like this green filter and everything with the URR, just implying, hey, there's radiation everywhere.
Sensing the looming siege of Moscow, the emergency government withdrew from the ravaged Don Republic, opting to fortify their defenses against the impending onslaught. The scorched void they left behind was filled by tens of thousands of Ukrainians, who by this point were survival experts.
So one thing, a lot of radiation will actually decay within 2 years, just both in terms of, here's it measured in terms of heat in megawatts, and note how it gets much, much lower, on the order of fractions of megawatts within just a couple of weeks. And dose drops off in a similar way. The main hazards after 2 years is going to be things like cesium-137, a prominent fission product that has a half-life of 30 years. But other fission products, such as iodine-131, which is the most hazardous immediately afterwards because it can get up because of its propensity to cause thyroid cancer, it's only got a half-life of 8 days, so if you're looking at a couple of years, that's not a hazard anymore. But cesium-137 is going to be the main one at this point, and that's going to be solid. It's a metal, and there's probably still going to be bits and pieces of it scattered everywhere in this scenario because they didn't really mention any cleanup effects. This is more of a discussion of war rather than cleanup, and I think people were more distracted by the war in this timeline versus the cleanup. So cesium-137 is probably going to be your primary hazard at this point.
At the time, the immediate region around Chernobyl had become hell on Earth, but the Caucasus were a close second. So, to get a better idea of where the Soviet military and resources
at the time, meaning 2 years after, or is it because there's going to be fighting there?
Were located, I found and made numerous maps, including this one, which features all the Soviet military air bases. So, as you can see, the Soviet republics in the Caucasus, like Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, still not you, feature a lot of both. On top of that, clouds filled with radioactive particles turn into rain once they hit more mountainous terrain. Factor in the cultural and religious diversity of the region.
So is he talking straight after the accident? Because in 2 years, a lot of this is, I mean, it's going to have blown through. It's going to have circulated around the air, around the world hundreds of times at this point. It's going to be so diluted.
We've got a recipe for mayhem. Okay, got that? All right. Hundreds of thousands of starving refugees, desperate for sanctuary, finding themselves trapped in the crossfire. Initially, it was every separatist faction for itself. Ossetians, Chechens, Dagestanis, and Kymiks turned against Russia.
I love all these flag people. Their little expressions.
Minorities, retreating into the mountains, armed to the teeth. Think Afghanistan, but with a dozen competing factions clawing for survival. But it didn't stop there. Toss in some of the world's largest oil fields and an expansionist Iranian regime. While Azerbaijan boasted abundant coal and oil, its 85% Shia population drew Iran's attention. The Soviet Union's collapse pushed the world to the brink of another recession.
Now that I can see if just like it's happened any other time in history, a great power collapses and some smaller regional or secondary powers come in to pick up what's left. Yeah, I could see that happening.
Ever the action man threw his support behind Saddam Hussein. Despite a 20% Muslim minority, the Soviet Union counted a mere 500 mosques and ruthlessly suppressed the religion.
I mean,
all that pent-up pressure would violently explode. Simultaneously, an international effort was made to support Georgia and Armenia, which were given aid, especially iodine.
Always good to have Georgia on your mind.
Tablets through the Black Sea. By 1988, the oil...
So the iodine tablets, they are given post-accident authorization by the emergency director to mitigate the effects of iodine-131 following the accident. But we're talking a couple of years later. So that isotope with a half-life of 8 days has long decayed away. And potassium iodine tablets, they're pretty nasty. They'll make you sick. Not like radiation sickness. I mean, you'd rather take potassium iodine tablets than get thyroid cancer, but you're just going to have all you're going to do at this point, 2 years later, is just get a bunch of people sick.
Shortage was felt globally, with the economies of Mexico, Argentina, Ireland, Greece, and Yugoslavia being hit particularly hard. Cuba and Mongolia were propped up by the vast Soviet investments, and were now both belly up. As in our timeline, the Yugoslavian breakup, which occurs a little earlier, is brutal, but due to the timing and global spiral, there is far less foreign intervention. To offset the energy crisis, America turned to Venezuela.
The America with the star and the sunglasses, yeah.
Algeria,
America.
And Saddam, while Europe grew overly reliant on Gaddafi's Libya.
The irony in this, and I know people aren't going to do it in this timeline, is building more nuclear power plants would help with energy independence especially for all those countries in Western Europe that were dependent on the Soviet Union for its vast supplies of natural gas. So nuclear power would be even more needed in this timeline than it would now. Crazy.
Mentioned Afghanistan, why not talk about the real thing? I mean, Chernobyl does happen in the midst of the Soviet-Afghan War.
That's true.
As they failed to tame the Mujahideen. Without a leader or a government, the war-weary Soviets under the command of Marshal Sergei Sokolov very hastily get the hell out of there. But unlike Peter's organized withdrawal, this looked more like a wild scramble. These war veterans were specifically recruited from regions far from Central Asia, as early experiments showed the Soviets that locals were too sympathetic to the Afghan cause. So imagine that you're a soldier who's been at war in the deserts and mountains of Afghanistan for years. You receive a postcard saying that the entire Union is imploding. Nuclear radiation is spilling out.
Yeah, that would be something. Yeah, you're off at war and home is worse than where you left. Yeah.
Is widespread. Raiders are ransacking villages.
He keeps showing these two guys. They look like video game characters.
And chances are your family is either dead or unreachable due to the infrastructural collapse. Treacherous terrain and enemies lie to the south, west, and east, and the road up north leads you to, let's see, a group of republics living in scattered but rich patches of land who are now rising up in revolution to form up their own nation. Oh boy. For decades, the Soviets attempted to Russify the Central Asian republics, and when that failed, they resorted to mass settlement of Russians and Ukrainians in what were now on paper the autonomous Soviet republics of Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan.
I didn't realize that. Now, maybe it shows what little I know about Soviet and Central Asian history, but I didn't realize it was resettlement practices that were the solution. I mean, resettlement was one of the key aspects of living in the Soviet system, the command economy. Everyone after the Chernobyl accident being told, "Oh yeah, by the way, you don't live in Pripyat anymore. You live somewhere else now."
Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan, all of which were majority Muslim. But in reality, the locals had only nominal control, while real power was in the hands of native Russians. And keep in mind, these are the most densely populated places east of the Ural Mountains, with Tashkent in particular being the fourth biggest city in the entire Union. In other words, the rebellious nationals were...
So now you got another case of... So basically another case of an oppressive ethnic minority with their boot over a majority, just like any other colonized region. I can see where this is going.
Perfect excuse for the Afghan veterans to make a living doing what they knew best. In 1986, the Soviets had just around 360,000 soldiers and a ton of military hardware. About a quarter of it was abandoned and captured by the Afghan resistance, while the rest made their way to the Central Asian republics. The bulk of the army, following its commander, occupied the Tajik people, while other military juntas made way to the rest. But this was easier said than done. The religious element and the vindictive Afghans aided by foreign nationals, including Osama bin Laden, chased the Soviets down to help the rebel republics. Out of all of them, the Kazakhs were the most widespread, and made up only 40% of the country. Excluding some pocket of resistance, the majority of them were either wiped out or fled to neighboring republics.
I have to say, I actually like this video a lot more because it gets more into the geopolitical aspect in certain regions that you probably haven't thought of. Like, I can't say I initially thought of these conflicts and rebellions that you would see in Central Asia when I first looked at what if Chernobyl was far worse. The science and the physics, I question the accuracy of. The geopolitical dominoes I see falling here. Now, granted, it could just be that I don't know as much about this stuff, but I can tell this channel knows a lot more about this stuff than at least I do. That this part of the alternate scenario seems a little bit more plausible than me. And I like that it's bringing things up that I wouldn't have initially thought of.
For the rest, within the next 3 years, the Soviets succumbed to the good old scorched earth tactic. Islamic fundamentalism grew rampant and prevailed in the intense conflict, but at a huge cost.
So it's kind of happening earlier in this timeline. Interesting.
Numerous heritage sites and urban centers were destroyed, as with the Mongol invasions. The breakdown of trade, infrastructure, and industry meant that this part of the world would need at least a century to return to the pre-Fallout War GDP and population numbers. One massive thing to keep in mind here is that due to the distraction of the Central Asian republics and Azerbaijan, the goals of Iran, Iraq, Al-Qaeda, and the United States shift in a completely different direction. In this timeline, the Soviet
As you're getting further away, the butterfly effect seems to be creating further and further branching paths. This is cool.
renegades are seen as the biggest enemies of Islam, and perhaps 9/11 never happens.
I mean, in this, just because during the Soviet-Afghan War, the U.S. supported the Mujahideen and the Taliban. The U.S. supported the Taliban, so a lot of politics, a lot of shifts can happen in just a few years. I don't know why I find that so humorous, just the cute little tiny guns and tiny people. Radiation doesn't normally affect snowfall levels, but if you're talking about but when you're dealing with crazy amounts of radiation in this hypothetical crazy scenario, it's crazy a couple of times, those particles could just create more surfaces for the water vapor to condense onto, potentially increasing the amount of snow. This has nothing to do with the type of nuclear winter that people discuss after large-scale nuclear exchanges or asteroid impacts as a result of lowering global temperatures or anything like that, just by making more surfaces and more particulate matter that could affect the snowfall levels. This is pretty out there, but so is this scenario.
Enter China, eyeing a slice of the fallen Soviet pie. Led by Deng Xiaoping, Mao's successor and industrial reformer, China boasted the world's second largest economy. Though it
Here we go, the use of nuclear weapons. I'm kind of surprised it took this long in this scenario.
confirmed the order, and several warheads smashed into the Gobi Desert, demonstrating his resolve. ICBMs had many fail-safe
Nuking the desert, huh? No, that's one way. This makes me think of more of this Fallout timeline where every weapon is nuclear tipped, not even necessarily that powerful, but just releases some radiation, because why not? Craziness.
Far East provinces of Russia are
This is so
sparsely
weird.
populated and barely industrialized. While the absence of resources and people didn't just make for great, this is why 90% of Russians live west of this line, real-life lore videos, there is not much going for this region. So why bother talking about it instead of Thatcher's failed re-election, Bin Laden's war with the Soviets, or the siege of Moscow? Well, it's because we can't just forget about the Iron Fleet. The Soviet Pacific Fleet started out as the B Squad, but by the 1980s it made up 32% of its naval capability due to the arms race. 800 ships, over 120 submarines, many of which were nuclear.
Yeah, the Soviets had quite a few nuclear submarines, and one key advantage of having those, if they're nuclear missile-armed nuclear submarines, is the whole idea of second strike. So if any of these scenarios that he just described escalate into nuclear war, I mean, good luck finding these, and they could enable essentially a destroyed country to fight back and have some revenge, because these missiles can be a lot harder to intercept because they can deploy much closer to their target, and you wouldn't have nearly as much warning time to even evacuate. By the way, nuclear missiles, ICBMs in general, are already pretty challenging to intercept. But here, you just have that much less of an alert time.
And 2 Kiev-class aircraft carriers. This considerable navy boasted at least 120,000 crewmen, all of which were loyal to Admiral Gennady Kvatov. Without a state to support it, and with the railway being blocked off by the new monarchy, this fleet wouldn't last long. Like the abandoned soldiers in Afghanistan.
Yeah, though interesting, the nuclear subs would probably last the longest just because they can go 20 years without refueling.
These soldiers knew they could never reach home, so they decided to make a new one. Admiral Kvatov approached communist China and offered to sell a considerable amount of his assets in return for a steady stream of supplies and diplomatic aid. Instead of building its navy, the CCP simply bought theirs and obtained the perfect comrade to fight the crazy Tsarist regime. The Far East provinces are almost entirely made up of Russian immigrants who opened their arms to various admirals. Each province became a self-governing state, bound to the supreme command of Kvatov and the loose Caucasus Federation. The cultural makeup of this new entity made it difficult for the Tsar to justify nukes, and the factions clashed in the conventional way. This is Cody of Alternate History Hub.
That was interesting, and I like how he went into how all these different regions were affected. And this, I have to say, looking at this scenario, it probably makes about as much sense. I mean, I would say it's probably about as realistic as a typical Hearts of Iron 4 mod. Nah, I appreciate the amount of effort he put into looking at potential scenarios on how, looked into the local geopolitics of various areas and seeing how a lot of these conflicts could emerge. But as I've said before, the amount of radiation that would result in this might as well be magic. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next time.